There we go.
Okay, nice. Yes, I'm happy to facilitate Dawn. So thank you everyone for being here and Georg especially for doing the last minute presentation call and accepting to come and discuss with us. So we are very interested in the work that you're doing with Johan and Kevin. Is that right?
That is correct.
And so yeah.
Yeah, where do you want me to start? At the end with what we are finding, or at the beginning of how we designed this research study and what kind of drove us to explore the funding in open source?
I would love to hear about the motivation first, I think.
All
But let
right.
me know if others disagree.
Yeah, so Johan, Kevin, and I, we've been around open source for several years, and I know Zerkan from going to the Sustain OSS events back when they were being hosted. And so sustainability of open source and funding has been something we care about. And we did a study that we presented last year at FOSDEM on what maintainers are currently saying they need, because we've had this conversation in the Sustain OSS group, we've had it across the foundations, in the open source projects, everywhere we are talking about what this is. But when you look at the academic literature, it's absent. And it was not documented in a way that academics can build on it. So we went out, we interviewed maintainers, and heard back that yes, funding is important, but we also need all these other things. We need to build that human infrastructure, is what we called it, so that we have the people and they have the skills and time to focus on the things. And we not always need money, we also need other things. So that's what we found out last year. We published that, that's all good. And then we wanted to swap onto the other side. So that's the starting point of the current study that I'm talking about today, of what does it look like from the funder perspective. We wanted to understand what is it that they are looking for when selecting. I'll show you our research, the interview questions actually, because that is the instrument that we used. And um, here I'm sharing my screen so you can see this, so you know exactly what we asked the funders. I got a safety notification. Is sharing working for you all?
Yes.
Excellent. So, of course, we wanted to know first who they are so we can capture the different nuances and context that they're coming from. Uh, we asked at a very high level, what does the funding landscape currently look like? Because we wanted to map out what is available to maintainers, to open source projects. And one of the insights that I found really interesting is there is funding available in the US, in Europe, but then outside of that, it becomes very sparse. We didn't find a lot of or any funders to talk to outside of the US and Europe. I reached out to my contacts in South America, in Africa, in Asia, and I asked, what is available on your continent? What do you know of? And I didn't get any referrals. I didn't get any connections because they said, all that money is in the US and in Europe. So that is something I found really interesting. And if you know of funding sources that are available, I think there are starting to be a push for it, but it's really not established. Or if it is established, it's not being perceived or known, even to the people who live on those continents. So that is a gap that I found really interesting. Then we asked about selection. So how do you decide which open source projects to fund? And could you expand on that selection criteria you have? Which metrics or signals, if any, are you using in the selection process? Because we wanted to know from a maintainer perspective, what could the maintainers, the projects do to be noticed, to be selected for funding? And then and I'll talk about what we found here because um, the short of it is it depends more on the relationships funders and maintainers develop than objective metrics. Um, that is also something that I found really interesting, and it's more of a finger in the air approach that many funders are currently taking. In impact, we wanted to know, okay, so funders are giving money or resources or support. And we talked to many different funding. Um, we had a very loose definition. Anyone who is supporting open source, whether it is some organization like the Sovereign Tech Agency, Alpha Omega. We talked with foundations like Eclipse. Um, we also, in the study, still went back to some maintainers and said, hey, we've heard from funders. Can you help match this? Is this your experience also? So when that funding is made, the funders usually have a source of that funding and they need to report up and secure those funds again. And so how do you track impact? How do you justify getting that funding again to give to open source? So how do you track that? What metrics do you use and how do you report that? So that's on that impact. And then in that already, we had lots of conversations and we didn't have time to ask many more questions. So we just asked if we had any blind spots, if there's anything else that we didn't cover that we needed to know about, and if there was anything that we could produce out of the research that funders would find helpful, and if they can make any new introduction. So that's the research instrument, the interview protocol that we used. And I'm gonna pause here. I really enjoy interactive conversations more so than me talking to a webcam. So I'm gonna pause here and give you all a chance to ask questions, comment on what you're seeing, whatever comes to mind.
Thank you, Georg. I very much appreciate the length of the questions because that's what I found as well is that we would put together 10, 15 questions and then would maybe get to five properly. And of course, we don't want to take too much time of their daily time. So I really appreciate how it's, I think, focusing on the things that you really want to get from and they seem to be vague, but focused enough so that people can answer. I'm really interested in the results.
Yeah, thank you, Adrian. And when you say they're vague in academic terms, when I think about creating an interview protocol, I want to avoid leading questions and I want to keep them open where I ask, hey, what comes to mind when I say this? And then can you give examples? Can you talk about this so that I don't get a specific answer I'm expecting, but I'm just opening up the conversation. And so when it comes across as vague, it's really because it's designed to be an open question. Alexandros.
Yes, yeah. First, thanks for these insights. I'm also really interested in the results. When you talked about basically the countries or regions which provide funding opportunities for maintainers, I thought about one initiative which I stepped over, which is called Floss Fund. Maybe you have heard about it, or probably you've heard about it. And now I quickly opened it, and it's somehow related to India. So it says something like started in 2024 at Ceruda, Floss Fund, blah, blah, blah. So apparently there is an initiative also outside Europe and the US, which came into my mind. So maybe that's kind of helpful for your data collection.
Yeah, thank you for bringing up Floss Fund. And I think there is a perception that we need to promote these initiatives more. So this one is started a little over a year ago, and we ran these interviews around that time. So I don't think there was enough time to really be known at that time. Yeah. Paul?
Yeah, I think the questions are great. From my perspective, I think I might suggest one, though, that I think could help flesh out the context and selection a little bit, and also has bearing on some level for impact. Because we sometimes, I think, tend to treat funding as a panacea, as, just a kind of a very general thing, but different funders have different sort of, if you like, strategic goals or things they want to set out to do, be it, improve resilience or cybersecurity, and or being more oriented to community funding. And certainly from the perspective of STA, we've had occasions when we're funding different things, and so the measurement of the impact is obviously different, right? And maybe it's worth considering a question at the kind of getting to know the participant section around, like, what is the overall goal of your organization or your funding? And you'll probably end up with, I imagine, like some very broadly sketched things about like strengthening the ecosystem or something like that, but perhaps there's space to just kind of drill that down a little bit and get a bit more specific could help.
Yeah, and from running these interviews, everyone talks about their objectives and their goals, whether it is in the context or no later than by the time we talk about selecting. There's a clarification that happens. We are selecting because this is what we want to do and achieve. So yes, absolutely, that is an important consideration, and in the interview data we have captured that, even without having a dedicated question for it, which is always a balance. How many questions do you put in interview protocol, and then does it start getting repetitive? So good call out that the objectives matter, and they matter so much that they come out in the way the questions are answered anyway. So I'm just sharing my experience here, so that hopefully this helps someone if you want to do something similar in the future, or so that you understand how we arrived at our results. So here's where we went next. We did about 20 interviews or so, and one of the things that we heard from our interview participants is that there is not a lot of agreement across the industry, across the different funders, on how to select, how to measure. That there are some issues around the popular and most widely used and known projects capture the funding, whereas lesser known ones are having a harder time to attract support. And so we heard that there is a need for coordination, more collaboration between the funders. And to foster that, we invited our interview participants to a workshop at FOSDEM, and we also invited a few others that are in this space that we didn't get to interview. And then the second reason we brought everyone together to talk about our findings is from a research perspective to validate that what we are synthesizing from the interviews, what we are seeing, makes sense, that it holds up to the experience, and also to start a conversation around, because there is so much variability, just to have a conversation. So we created this workshop brief, and in our analysis we focused on impact tracking, impact reporting, that piece of our interviews. So we captured a lot of things, but to keep the conversation focused, we're really focusing on the funding impact. And I want to highlight a few themes. Quick shout out to our sponsors. RISE is where Johan works, Creighton is where Kevin works, and Bitergia is where I worked. And then here's what we found. So for the vision and strategy of the funder, this is what Paul was asking about. This is so important on what the strategic direction is, that it influences how the impact is tracked and reported, because that shapes the lens that funders are looking through and what they're trying to accomplish. And so when it comes to the impact logic, is what we call it. It is taking that vision and strategy and creating a frame around it on these are the kinds of things that we are affecting. So if it is an organization that focuses on improving security, they would be looking at metrics or stories around finding vulnerabilities, getting them closed, how long it takes, avoiding disastrous outcomes, and so on and so forth, or refactoring, simplifying architecture. If the story is around we want to secure our foundation, then it is things about how do we find what is in our foundation, how do we make sure we capture broad categories, and a lot of it boils down to stories, because the whatever metrics or numbers that we can talk about, they don't tell a compelling enough story. Oftentimes, especially when it's reported out to those who control the purse strings, it is the stories, the emotional side to this, that actually allows for funding to continue to flow. We also found this theory of change, and one of the problems is we want to improve it to avoid bad outcomes, and in the absence of bad outcomes, what can we report about? So that is a challenge that we heard about time and time again. So that is the setup. When it then comes down to operationalizing the impact, how do you break it down into something that you can put a number to and that you can measure? It is going towards the goal, easy to justify, relatively straightforward, but there are limitations for this, because those metrics are not always, the metrics that we want to have are not always easy to capture or available. And so that makes it often systematically undermeasured as a result of that difficulty. We have already talked about things that didn't go wrong. Being able to measure something that didn't happen is hard. So that's a challenge. Not that we have a solution to this, but we are just capturing this as a challenge. And then considering funding structures. This is also where, depending on how the support is given, whether it's a grant, a contract, a stipend, whether it has milestones or not, whether it's work for hire, it builds in reporting cycles. And one of the things that I thought seemed to work really well, and I've heard a few times, is when the project or the maintainers are asked to write monthly summaries. Here's what we did, here's what the funding allowed us to do, here is the improvements that we made. And so that creates a track record that we can point back to. And then in an annual or biannual or whatever reporting cycle, a bigger report can be assembled from those smaller monthly reports. It also creates check-in points and transparency. Talking about that one, there's also something we heard about with regards to the relationship between the one who gives the money and the one who receives the money. And there can be an effect where the projects or maintainers that receive funding are starting to feel pressure because they have received funding, and then if they perceive not meeting deadlines, not being able to do the things that they wanted to do because life happens, whatever, then they become silent. And so to foster a continuous flow of information, one thing that seems promising is to put projects that are being funded into cohorts, and they can talk amongst the peers, and then the funder, just based on that chatter and the check-ins, where the peers are more likely to ask each other for advice or help than go to the perceived overlord, where the power differential is at least perceived. It allows to capture misalignments or issues earlier and to respond faster. So that is something I found interesting, to group the recipients into cohorts. When we talk about types of impact, this is how the projects were improved, whether it is we have new CI/CD, pipeline integrations, more automated testing, we have reduced time to close pull requests, or we are reducing the backlog, we are bringing more people in, we are able to implement new features, whatever it is. So that is also adoption was another type of impact that we heard about, where some projects say we are more widely used, or funders said one of the things I want to have is, because we fund projects and they improve, that they also become more widely used and have a more positive impact in the ecosystem, because we want to leverage. Where we spend the money on projects, we want to impact not just current users, but also more users and grow that adoption. That's this point about downstream use and adoption. Innovation and public good. There are also funders who are not just about maintenance funding, which is a fairly new concept from what we hear. Traditionally, there was more funding available for developing new features, for fixing things that had gone wrong, and then in the last years, maintenance funding has become available, and that's still a rather new thing. But creating things, driving innovation, doing something for the public good are also impacts that that funders care about. Measurement approach. Some of you have written a fantastic paper, what was it now, 2 years ago, about quantitative, qualitative, and how to approach that. So we heard many of those themes again here. So I don't want to talk too much about that, since you already have fantastic resource on that. I don't think we had anything new or something surprising in here that I want to highlight. The impact reporting, though, this is where we asked, okay, so how do you report out? And a lot of the funders have annual reports that they put out, and that helps secure additional funding or show the impact that the funders had. In the reporting, some metrics are important, but really that narrative and the key message and tying it together into here's what we set out as a funding agency to do, and these are all the things that we have done, and this is the positive impact that we have, and the larger picture, how that affects the ecosystem. Those are good stories to tell, but really difficult to put into numbers. And then also the target audience is often considered, because if it is a policy maker, government, they need to hear different things than if it is private, corporate investors who care more about securing the foundation of their own SBOM, whereas the governments, they care more about the public good and innovation and driving the economy forward as a whole. So that is the summary of the things that we found in the interviews. So I can pause here, because I then have also, after the workshop, we had some reflections that we shared at FOSDEM that I can talk about. But I wanted to pause here, and now that we've gone through this impact brief, which I'm also happy to share with you all if you're interested.
I might jump in quickly to ask a question. Maybe I didn't hear it exactly, but you had this paragraph about downstream impact or something like that. I think section 4 or something. Could you quickly summarize again, because I didn't get that point completely? What did the people talk about the impact of basically improvements or funding when it comes to downstream effects kind of rippling through the ecosystem?
This 4.3, this is section.
Yeah.
So this is in the section of types of impact. And we had funders that wanted to make a positive impact in a certain domain or field or use cases. And so for example, I'll just make this up. If the goal was to improve for reporters, that they can securely do reporting on the ground in situations where the conversations and communication needs to be secured. If that is the context, and then the funder goes and funds open source projects because they believe these are the technologies that reporters need in crisis environments where they are being prosecuted, whatever, and it keeps them safe, then funding the open source project is all good and well, but they want to see that reporters actually take up the tools and start using them, because that is the ultimate outcome that they are going for. The technology is just the means to an end.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. So this was especially interesting for Technology for Good, the Digital Public Goods Alliance associated kind of funding mechanisms, where we are creating technology not just to improve the technology, but to drive social impact. Serkan is asking, does the funding increase the adoption? In some cases, because a project received funding, now there are agencies, there are governments, there are...
Georg, I was trying to clarify what Alexandros was asking, let's say that. I think that was one of the key points, metrics that you are interested in. So I was just trying to reply to Alexandros.
Okay.
But this adoption part is, I think, critical for all of us, right? That we were just discussing the practitioner's guide as well. That over there also that we are wondering whether we can have a metric for adoption. I think the best one that we have, ecosystems, for instance, is doing a good job over there. Do you have any, let's say, methods or recommendations to measure that adoption? Is there any conversation about that?
A lot of it is because the maintainers know who is taking on a project if they hear about it, especially if there is a migration project and people come and ask for help. So it's anecdotal. I know there is SCARF, which is a technical solution to measure downloads and can be embedded in the software to also have metrics on actual usage. But that's about the extent of it. But to build on that, does funding increase adoption? Yes, when a project has a funder, there are users, agencies, or governments that see this funding as an endorsement. And now they are able to justify to their stakeholders that, yes, we can build on this because it is recognized as a good solution and has received funding from whatever funding agency. So it can kickstart an adoption cycle. Or sometimes we have open source technologies that are developed in one context, by one country, by one municipality, and building a coalition of others that come in and share. A funder can help facilitate that process also. That's also something we have seen.
Georg, I do have a question, but I was wondering if it's maybe better to pose it at the end because I think it's a general question. Or I was wondering if there's anything else you wanted to present.
I'm happy to stop at any time. I'm also happy to share the early insights, the kind of what we learned from the workshop. But I think this conversation is really good and helpful already. And if there are other agenda items, I'm happy to just call it good, because you can watch this also on the FOSDEM recording.
We don't really have any agenda items, but I can tell you my question and then you can decide whether now is the good time to answer it. I was wondering if any of the funders that you interviewed had experience funding things other than open source. So maybe research institutions, I don't know, maybe individuals, but not in this open source project sense, and whether they reflected on some of the differences that there is in funding open source versus, I don't know, maybe the bigger funds, or when it's not as distributed as here. Yeah, but if not, then maybe these people were experts in open source and didn't do funding in other domains.
Yeah, so we heard about funding being available for open source from general funders, like libraries or science funders that put in open source as a requirement, or they fund a certain open source tool because it helps several other of their project engagements. So we heard about those opportunities, but they are not the focus that we had, and we did not specifically interview those, I want to call them adjacent funders that are open source adjacent, but they're not dedicated to open source. So our interview partners were dedicated or had a specific branch focused on open source, and we only asked about that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, happy to chat more. I also know we like to end early and we only have 10 minutes left.
Does anyone have any other questions or discussion points for Georg?
I would add, if you could, if you want to drop a few links, like the document that you put in the chat, it's not a link, so I can't put it in the notes, but maybe if you could drop a few links in the notes. We already linked to your FOSDEM talk, but that would be helpful.
Okay, yeah, I will make the document available as a Google Drive link. For
Perfect.
sure.
Thank you so much. I did also have a couple of reminders. If you think of any more questions for Georg, we still have time, so we can come back to that. But we have a couple of CFPs that are open. So the Apache Software Foundation's Community Over Code, which is going to be in October in Glasgow, Scotland. The CFP deadline is March 20th, so that's coming up in a couple of weeks. All Things Open, which is in Raleigh in October. The CFP deadline is March 31st. So I would encourage you, if you're interested in attending either of those events, to submit into the call for proposals. And I don't know if anybody else has any reminders, other open CFPs, interesting events coming up. Okay. Anybody think of any final questions for Georg?
Maybe just on when you're planning to publish, Georg, or is this going to be a scientific article in the end?
Yes, we are going to, I think the submission deadline is here end of March. So it will be published in a scientific venue. I don't remember what the timeline is when it would be finally published, but we're working on it.
Okay, nice. Oh, and actually another thing that came to mind is I think you said that when they're selecting open source projects, many times it actually depends on the relationship that they have with the maintainers, or the relationships that they had beforehand with the maintainers, to matter more rather than the metrics. And I was wondering if the funders reflected on whether that's a good or bad thing, or whether they would want to change that, or just they don't know how to change that.
Yeah, that was, so that didn't really come out in the interviews. That was something we learned during the workshop when we were all sitting together, and in the conversation of examples, it just like, oh, there's a pattern that we have personal relationships, and it makes funding more difficult to be sustainable, because when someone leaves, on either side, whether within the funder and they had all the personal relationships and contacts and they knew who to talk to, etc., even if they leave behind the contact list, those personal relationships need to be established again. Or if someone in the projects leaves. So it is, that was the sense that I got from the conversation. It makes the system as it is right now fragile.
Mm.
And is there a way to change it? We didn't have a solution on hand. It is something that we need to think about, and how can it be done differently?
Yeah, and I'm guessing there's also this aspect of if they maybe had enough participants who are applying, and then maybe the metric side can come out, and so that if there's 100 applications to go through, then the metrics would come forward. But maybe it's the case that since there's this mismatch between people who need the funding not finding these funders, then it kind of then is left to those who know about it and have the relationships with the funders.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a couple dynamics at play that we can talk about. One is the amount of effort that is required to apply for funding, where maintainers say, hey, I'm just not even gonna bother. So unless they already have a personal relationship, some will not apply to a program that tries to be as objective as possible. So what that then incentivizes is those who apply for it, they have a grant writer or someone who is really dedicated to going after this funding, but they may not be the ones who actually do the work, who benefit the open source projects, and their work on securing the funding evaporates without impacting the open source that actually needed the funding to begin with. So those are concerns, and why these personal trust relationships right now are so important, or seen as important. Like I said, I don't have a good solution for it.
It's okay. Thank you, Georg. Thank you so much for the talk. Okay, Serkan, go ahead.
Yeah, one last thing that I could mention is that it would be interesting to know what is the, for instance, approved, rejected ratio, let's say. How many people submit to the fund and how many of them are being approved, let's say. The ratio is usually was very low, for instance, for the funds that I was, when I was chatting, let's say, for, I think, Open Technology Fund, it was like 5%. Invest in infrastructure, I think similar ratio, etc. Do you know anything about that, or do you collect that kind of information? That would be interesting to know.
I agree, it would be very interesting to know, but it was not focus of our study and we did not ask about it.
All right, yeah. Yep.
Okay, nice. Thank you so much, Georg. So we will meet in 2 weeks' time. I'm contacting Amy O'Donnell from Nominet and hoping that she can present for us. But if not, we'll be in touch and figure out what the agenda is for the next meeting. Thank you so much, everyone.
Yep.
Bye,
Thank you, Georg.
everybody.
Cheers.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thanks for
Bye-bye.
having me. Have a good day.
You too.